Welcome to the Civic Brief with Dr. Isaiah Ike Wilson III, where complex issues meet everyday lives. Now, let's begin.
Friends, welcome back to the Civic Brief. I'm Dr. Ike Wilson. Now, in this episode 3 of our experience number 9 of the Civic Brief, our episode where we apply my proprietary strategic planning and assessment model called the WiSE way to condition states of our times, right? Make all this theory, this history, this contextualization very real and practical in terms of a strategy to action plan relevancy to all of us, from the individual all the way up to the, frankly, heads of state, founders and CEOs of all types, spread all between those two frames. What I want to do today in this WiSE way application is I want to talk, again, no surprise here, given our focus in the Civic Brief, I want to talk about strategy. I want to talk about strategy not in a world of stability, however, but in a world that has lost its balance point. We all understand this, whether you are a founder, a CEO of a company, a startup, trying to go from that Jim Collins good to great, trying to cope with and work through that threshold crossing that I talk a lot about, borrowed from the great anthropologist Joseph Campbell. Those threshold moments into that liminal space, that uncharted space of transition. Again, whether it's a challenge of a time of and conditioned state of certainty of a market in transition, of a world order in transition, of a household in grand transition brought on by shocks from without, as well as shocks from within, or on a more positive aim standpoint, intentional transitions that bring their own, although and albeit positive aims type of ambiguity, but the kind of ambiguity that excites us, right? As human beings, as founders, as CEOs, as framers, as frankly human beings on that exploratory of not just mitigating the potential negative risk, the challenging and deleterious risk, but taking charge of our own destiny, taking agency and risk taking for positive cause, right? Trying to transition, again, as an example, our company from, say, startup to mid-cap, taking advantage and trying to get, frankly, ahead of all herds, innovatively, critically, and creatively into maximization of shareholder value importantly, without losing our core internal value proposition. This is the strategy that I want to talk about in this context of our markets and our worlds and our households of stability transitioning into instability because those worlds have seemingly all of a sudden lost their balance point. I want to talk about that balance point quite a bit in this application. And I want to do so because here's the reality. Regardless of whether we're talking geopolitics or individual company dynamics or household engagements, we're no longer operating, regardless of type and kind, we're no longer operating in a system with single center of gravity. We're operating in what I call, and I borrow this from the world of astrophysics, we're operating what I call a three-body world. And within it, all the three-body problems that come with that world. And in that world, strategy is no longer about control. It's about coherence and coherency. Now, for decades, the United States functioned as something more than just a powerful state, a forceful state. It functioned as a system stabilizer, emphasis on system, in the role and the responsibility of guaranteeing power, regulating power, stabilizer. From, again, a borrow from and a clean transposition, frankly, from the world of physics and astrophysics more poignantly. This functioning as a system stabilizer becoming a kind of geopolitical Lagrange point, a balancing dynamic of competing forces, absorbing shocks and creating zones of relative order, emphasis on relative transitory order. These are not perfect balances, but the beauty of Lagrange points in astrophysics and in geopolitics and in geoeconomic market affairs is that these Lagrange points create zones of relative order. They're not perfect again, but they are predictable. They lend themselves to predictability. Today, that stabilizing function is, to put it kindly, intermittent. And again, all across all sectors, public, private, governmental, non-governmental, commercial, defense, development, diplomacy, et cetera, et cetera. The stabilizing function is not gone, but it is increasingly inconsistent. And when that happens, any system doesn't doesn't collapse, but they do begin to behave very differently, increasingly unpredictably. Competition, well, it begins to spread across domains. Crises cascade instead of staying contained. The casualty and the consequence of this is a fragmentation of that thing I talk a lot about, where trust lives. Legitimacy starts to fragment. This is what we call compound security conditions, and within it, the compound security dilemma, where pressure in one domain immediately affects all others. Now, to understand how to operate in this kind of environment, we need a different model, not one that's not linear, not single-centered, but systemic. Let's think of modern states, markets, as governed by three interacting forces. First, external competition. Second, internal cohesion. Thirdly, institutional legitimacy. Now, when those three reinforce each other, systems, markets, world systems, well, they tend to hold, to have that balance, that relative balance. When they work against each other, however, that's where we begin to see systems fracture. Let's look at the United States today. Rising geopolitical competition, deepening domestic polarization, declining institutional trust. Now, these aren't separate problems. They are structurally linked. And that's the key insight. You don't solve one without affecting all the others. Now, if the system no longer has a stable and single stable stabilizer, well, what do we then do? I would say we don't try to recreate the past. We redesign the function. This is what I call the WiSE Lagrange Doctrine. It's simply a shift from singular dominance to distributed stabilization, from control to resilience by design, by architectural design. And it rests on four practical moves. First, from hegemon to architect. The United States must stop trying to be the system and start designing the system. Transpose that down, founders and CEOs, to your own companies as systems, right? What does this mean? Whether we're talking geopolitics or market company dynamics, well, that means building networks of stabilizers. Back to the geopolitical, for example. In the Indo-Pacific, you don't rely on one alliance, you build layered partnerships. AUKUS, the Quad, bilateral security ties. Each node absorbs pressure, and therefore together they create that Lagrange balance. That, my friends, is a polycentric Lagrange system. Second, legitimacy as strategic infrastructure. Now, here's the hard truth. Legitimacy is not a byproduct. And you've heard me talk about legitimacy before. We like to think about legitimacy as this soft, fuzzy, moralism type of things. All that important, but we tend to soften the importance of legitimacy when we talk about legitimacy in that way. Friends, legitimacy is a hard power. It's architectural. It has structure and impactful structure at that. It's not a byproduct. It's a core capability. And without it, alliances weaken. Policies lack durability. Adversaries, competitors gain narrative advantage. An example, let's look at the Ukraine. The military supports matters, but the legitimacy of the cause is what sustains coalition cohesion over the long term. Legitimacy, my friends, is what gives strategy endurance. In compound security terms, it's the decisive mass in the system. Thirdly, design for absorption, not efficiency. Now, for 30 years, we optimized for efficiency, lean systems, just-in-time supply chains, minimal redundancy. That works until it doesn't. In a compound world, in a compound marketplace, you don't design for speed. You design for shock absorption. For example, let's look at COVID. Global systems didn't fail because of a single shock. They failed because they couldn't absorb cascading shocks. Resilience now means redundancy, flexibility, adaptive capacity. Fourth, you've heard me talk about this before in other contexts, maxi-min strategy at critical nodes, emphasis on at critical nodes. You don't try to control everything. CEOs, founders, listen up. You shape key nodes where influence multiplies, where they maximize advantage, and importantly, where they minimize systemic risk. Here's an example. Let's look at the semiconductor market. You don't dominate every industry. You secure the nodes that everything else depends on. Here's where Taiwan takes on a grander importance than its small, tiny island self. Advanced chip manufacturing, supply chain choke points. That's maxi-min strategy in practice. Now, what does this look like in practice? Put it all together, the strategy starts to look different. Not how do we win everywhere, but how do we keep the system from breaking under increasing cascading stress and pressures? You integrate domestic renewal with foreign policy. As a company, you integrate market renewal with internal coherency and fidelity between C-suite and program management and workers on and at the floor level, the production level, right? You align economic, technological, and security strategies. You build coalitions that can flex, not just endure. You frankly plan for not one future, but for multiple possible trajectories. This is what I call bounded anticipation. Now, let me leave you with this. The challenge of our time is not that the world is becoming more competitive. Folks, it's always been and always will be. The challenge is that the stabilizing structures we depend on are no longer sufficient as they are. And so the task now is different, not to restore control, but to design systems that can hold under pressure, because systems don't collapse because they are challenged. They collapse because they lose coherence. The WiSE Lagrange Doctrine is about ensuring that they don't. Friends, this has been another episode of the WiSE Way application of the Civic Brief. I'm Dr. Ike Wilson, and again, this is the WiSE Way. Until next time, cheers.
Thanks for tuning into the Civic Brief. Got questions, insights, or ideas? Join us at thecivicbrief.com to continue the dialogue. Subscribe, share, and be part of shaping the future, one brief at a time.